So moving right along here, now we'll talk about rhetoric in the Odyssey, and first go over Aristotle's rhetoric as similar to his text on narrative, and specifically catharsis, the foundational piece on narrative to give us a really fundamental understanding of narrative so we can look at how it functions in the various texts we study as examples of rhetoric. And here you have a picture of Odysseus making his plea to Nausicaa, Prince Nausicaa, and her father, King Alcinous of Phakia, to give him his ship to get home. And so this is why Odyssey books 7 and 8 are our case study for our first example of rhetoric, because we really see some persuasive speeches, powerful speeches from Odysseus in this book. And as I've mentioned before, there's 2 tracks you can take as an English studies major, one being the literary track, where you'll study drama, poetry, and fiction in more detail, the other being the rhetoric track. And so my goal here partly is to give you a better understanding of rhetoric and what it is so that you can make a very informed decision when you make that decision. And a lot has been done with rhetoric over the years, and we'll study further instances of it. But why not start with the original master, Aristotle? So a rhetorician, according to Aristotle, is someone who is always able to see what is persuasive. Stop and let that marinate for a minute. Think about that phrase. Read it closely there. I mean, we know about being persuasive, but being able to see what is persuasive is not just being able to convince someone to your opinion. It's being able to see how others convince others to their opinions, how rhetoric works in any given situation. That's the ability of the master rhetorician. So correspondingly, rhetoric itself, defined by Aristotle, would be the ability to see what is possibly persuasive in every given case. Now, this makes the rhetorician sound like someone who can just convince anyone of anything, who could sell ice in Antarctica. It's not quite true. And to illustrate why that's not quite true, Aristotle uses an analogy of a physician or a doctor, which is that the rhetorician has a complete grasp of his method if he discovers the available means of persuasion, though he is not always able to convince everybody. So Aristotle recognizes the limits of human beings, but at the same time says a true, deep understanding of rhetoric enables one to see how rhetoric works in a variety of situations, not just one kind of situation or context. Because you, as a reader and a writer, will communicate in all different kinds of contexts and situations. And so being able to see what would work in one situation versus another is a level of rhetorical mastery and sensitivity that the rhetorician, according to Aristotle, possesses. But that doesn't mean you'll be able to convince everybody of everything, because we're only human. And so I think that's a good kind of qualifier here from Aristotle. Another really important thing, absolutely essential thing to cover before we go further, is the neutrality of rhetoric. Rhetoric, according to Aristotle, is a neutral tool that can be used by virtuous or depraved people. If we were in a classroom, before jumping right into this content, I would have asked you, what is your definition or understanding of rhetoric before doing any of these readings? And we would have taken a few minutes and had a conversation about that. Because this may be, for many of you or all of you or a lot of you, your first exposure to the concept of rhetoric and in any kind of depth. But it's a word I think most people are familiar with, and usually, culturally speaking, today in the U.S., it has a very negative connotation. It's associated with manipulation. That's very important to keep in mind, that persuasion and manipulation are not the same thing. And so Aristotle, in writing on rhetoric, saw it as neutral. It could certainly be used to manipulate people and to persuade people for two horrible things or horrible reasons. But it isn't always used that way. And it could be used for very virtuous or good reasons by good people as well. So it's more of a neutral thing. that can swing both directions. And just because people have used it for evil or wicked things does not mean that the concept of rhetoric itself is evil or wicked. So it's very important to understand that early on here. Aristotle also talks about the need for rhetoric. So if the person's goal were just or virtuous, a lot of people assume that they wouldn't need rhetoric, that the veracity of that truth or the justice of that truth would just come right on through. The sad thing is that's not the case. And so you probably, if you take some time to think about this, have your own experience with these struggles. For instance, maybe you've really had something very important you wanted to communicate, and you were right. You were saying the truth. You were just. But it just did not resonate with your audience for a variety of reasons. Because audience is the thing Aristotle throws into the mix here that's so important. It complicates everything, but it's absolutely fundamental to understand, right? You can have the best, most truthful, most just idea in the world. If it doesn't resonate with the audience, it falls flat. So with rhetoric, there's always this relationship between author and audience. You can never do away with it. Any rhetorical situation has an author and an audience. And so you have to have rhetorical tools or strategies to reach and connect with an audience, even if your goal is completely just and completely virtuous. So this need for rhetoric is connected to the neutrality of rhetoric. And I want to take it a step farther than even the author of our Stanford Encyclopedia entry went here and say, not only does just communicating a just message have a need for rhetorical tools, but I would say, does using rhetorical tools mean someone is not being straightforward? I think it's not just a matter of we need rhetorical tools even when our means are altruistic or our goal is altruistic. I think it means we're just always using rhetoric. We don't necessarily realize it until we do a study like this. But like every conversation, every email, every text message, every social media post, every interaction between two or more human beings involves rhetoric to some degree. And so there's nothing wicked or evil about rhetoric at all. It's a fundamental part of communication. And if we understand it better, we don't become master manipulators. We become better, more effective communicators. Because we'll always have an audience if we're communicating. And we need to understand our audience to communicate with them effectively. And so that's the last part here, this audience part. And the encyclopedia entry says, to quote, even those who just try to establish what is just and true need the help of rhetoric when they are faced with a public audience. So you may have the best idea in the world, like I said, but your audience might be a hostile audience. They might have just different beliefs or values or perspective from you. And you need to figure out where that audience is, what they believe and value, so that you can figure out the best means to communicate with them. Maybe you have a true and just idea, but you come in giving a PowerPoint and they were expecting something a little less formal. Maybe you have a great message. You're trying to convince someone to agree with you, a relative on Facebook, but your language you use is too formal for Facebook, or you're a great fit for a job interview, but your language isn't formal enough in that job interview setting. This is why rhetoric is so very important. So now that we've covered what rhetoric is, the next thing is, how do we do it? According to Aristotle, there are three primary means of persuasion. And a little bit of background here before we get straight to the means. These would all be considered technical means of persuasion, which means they are provided by the speaker. Non-technical means of persuasion would be pre-existing facts, witnesses, testimonies, etc. Now, a speaker can be using the technical approach and can draw on pre-existing facts or witnesses as evidence to support their approach. But the facts, the evidence can't speak for themselves. The speaker has to do something with them, has to show to the audience how their facts or their evidence prove their argument, and so that they then become used in a technical way. And this difference may seem arbitrary, but it's actually fundamental. This is why, one, you have to cite your sources when you write a paper and you use other sources. Even if you're just using the Odyssey itself, you have to cite it. And two, this is why you can't just quote something in writing or speech and then move on. You have to explain the relevance to the conversation, because you may see how this passage from the Odyssey illustrates your point about gender roles. But if you don't explain to the reader, the audience, how that passage from the Odyssey illustrates your point about gender roles, it'll fall flat. So that's the dimension that audience adds. And that's why you need evidence, but why you have to work with the evidence, can't allow it to speak for itself. And it's a really good lesson, because we come up with great ideas when we're writing about literature, but the great ideas fall flat without good evidence and without good explanation, analysis of that evidence. Because something that may seem obvious to us, it's because it's been swimming in our head for weeks or days. It's not obvious to our readers, to our audience. And Aristotle is the one who said, think about the audience. And that's why rhetoric's so important. So now to the details, the three means of persuasion. A speech, which the ancient Greeks, again, many people were illiterate, they mostly used speeches. So take the term speech here and interpret it in a broad context, really any type of text: book, poem, play, film, movie, video game, etc. A speech or any kind of text consists of three things: author, subject matter, and audience. Thus, the three means of persuasion are the character or the credibility, what the Greeks called the ethos of the speaker, the emotional state or response of the audience, which is pathos, and the logic of the argument itself, which is ethos. There's also a dimension of timeliness, which we call kairos, although Aristotle doesn't speak about that directly. And then two types of arguments emerge from this. Inductive arguments are where people use observations to reach a conclusion, and this is what usually scientists do. They observe something in nature and say, oh, this must be what happened, or sociologists, psychologists do that too. What we mainly do in the humanities, although there is some place in the humanities for inductive arguments, what we mainly do are deductive arguments, which is where we start with the conclusion. And then we use premise, what Aristotle called premises, or we would call supporting points, to prove our argument or our thesis. And this is why I always advise, to, as I will in lesson 4 here, to, after you finish the first draft of a paper, make your conclusion the intro to the second draft, or rework your intro to reflect what you've now discovered your argument truly is, because the writing process helps us figure out our argument. And with deductive arguments like we make in the humanities, you want to start with the conclusion. So this is what I'm setting out to prove. I will now show you all my premises and all the evidence and all the analysis of the evidence to prove this conclusion so that you too agree with it. That's a deductive argument. And that's the kind of argument you make in a class like this. You might say something in your first paper along the lines of, the Odyssey communicates blank, fill in the blank, about gender roles because, fill in the blank. That's a conclusion you have made through your analysis of the Odyssey. So you would state that conclusion to readers and then show them the analysis you've done to prove it. We call that the enthymeme, or the body of persuasion. So if you just have an argument with no rationale or reason behind it, that's a claim or a maxim. So one of the examples Aristotle gives is, there's no man among us who is free. We call that a maxim because that's like a claim that's been around a long time, a lot of people might agree with, but there's no reasoning behind it. So it's not an enthymeme. But if we give a reason, it becomes an enthymeme. There's no man among us who is free, for all are slaves of money or of chance. So there's a reason now. So an enthymeme is the body of persuasion, or a claim plus a reason. So if you said, the Odyssey portrays women in negative ways, well, that's an interesting claim, but it's not an enthymeme. It's not truly an argument yet. Enthymeme and argument are essentially synonyms. But if you said, the Odyssey portrays women in a negative way because it objectifies characters such as Calypso or Nausicaa, now you have I don't agree with that statement, I'm just saying. Now you have, as an example, now you have an enthymeme because you have a claim and a reason. So these are the most fundamental, most important things from Aristotle's rhetoric, you can now look at any text and look for these things, which is what we call rhetorical analysis. You can also use them to craft better arguments yourself, which is one of the main reasons why we study rhetoric. We study rhetoric to understand how other arguments function so that we know how someone might be trying to persuade us, and to learn how to write better arguments ourselves so that we can also persuade others. And before we move on, I want to give you this illustration here because I think it's always helpful to be able to visualize things. So we call this the rhetorical triangle. You've got the credibility of the speaker, the logic of the message, the emotions of the audience, and the text in the middle, right? Which can be any medium. And the whole thing is surrounded by the rhetorical situation. You always have to consider context, which is again why I argue that it's important to consider the historical context when studying a text, for instance, like the Odyssey. So let this visual linger. Hopefully it's helpful to understanding these fundamental concepts. Now let's take a look at the Odyssey itself. And I don't know why this bullet point showed up already. Something must be wrong with the PowerPoint. I apologize. But let's take a look at the Odyssey itself and the rhetoric of two passages. And then after we look at the rhetoric of two passages, we'll transition to the discussion board questions and close out. So the question is really basic here. What rhetorical strategies does Odysseus use to convince the Phaeacians to send him home? So just think about everything we just said. Credibility, emotion, logic, claims and reasoning. What is Odysseus trying to do? What are the reasons he gives? And what are the rhetorical strategies he uses to convince them? Here's the first example. King Alcinous of the Phaeacians, wary Odysseus countered, cross that thought from your mind. I'm nothing like the immortal gods who rule the skies, either in build or breeding. I'm just a mortal man. Whom do you know most saddled down with sorrow? They are the ones I'd equal, grief for grief. And I could tell a tale of still more hardship, all I've suffered, thanks to the gods' will. But despite my misery, let me finish dinner. The belly's a shameless dog, there's nothing worse. Always insisting, pressing, it never lets us forget. Destroyed as I am, my heart racked with sadness, sick with anguish, still it keeps demanding, eat, drink. It blots out all the memory of my pain, commanding, fill me up. But you, at the first light of day, hurry, please, to set your unlucky guest on his own home soil. How much I have suffered. Oh, just let me see my lands, my serving men, and the grand high-roofed house. Then I can die in peace. So his goal here is for the Phaeacians to give him a ship so he can just sail home easily, because he doesn't have a ship anymore. It's been destroyed by Poseidon and Zeus, various points. His audience is the Phaeacians. So his claim is, this is much more subtle than what you would do in a paper, where you would state your claim directly in a paper. Here it's much more subtle. So his claim is, give me a boat. And he says that at the end. Oh, just let me see my lands, my serving men. And then what are his reasons? That's a little more complicated. He's been through a lot. He wants to die in peace. I would add his people need him. And what are his rhetorical strategies? Well, you see character immediately, because he's responding to King Alcinous, comparing him to the gods here. The Phaeacians are flatterers, and Odysseus is pretty impressive. So he's saying, I'm not like the gods. Excuse me. So Alcinous has just compared Odysseus to the gods. And Odysseus counters by saying, I'm nothing like the immortal gods who rule the sky. Think whoever is the saddest person you know, that's me. And so he's doing like two things at the same time. One, he's showing his humility. He's not bragging. He's not boasting, I am like the gods, even though in a lot of ways he is. And two, he's drawing attention to his struggles, his suffering, because that might evoke sympathy in the Phaeacians and help him with his rhetorical purpose here. So you've got both ethos, the credibility of his humility, and 2, the pathos, the emotion he stirs up in his audience by drawing attention to his grief and his struggles. And that continues to build as he talks about his misery. The allusion to eating dinner is interesting. I mean, because it shows how we all have things, needs pressing against us. And that's part of the human struggle. And finally, he does hit the logic at the end where he talks about going home so that he can die in peace. It just makes sense that it's time for him to be there. So you've got a strong rhetorical appeal here on Odysseus' part to send him home. Let's look at one more example before we close out with the discussion. So the next encounter, which is one of my favorite scenes in the Odyssey, is with Broadsea, when in Book 8 they're doing the games, the contests. And it's interesting because it's an instance where Odysseus shows his physical prowess in addition to his mental prowess. And you've got Broadsea as this, big buff Phaeacian is kind of taunting him, saying, you may be a good speaker, but you're not very good. You wouldn't be able to do well at the physical games. You wouldn't be able to throw a discus very far. And here is Odysseus' response to this, meathead taunting him. With a dark glance, wily Odysseus shot back. Indecent talk, my friend. You're a reckless fool. I see that. So the gods don't hand out all their gifts at once, not belled and brains and flowing speech to all. One man may fail to impress us with his looks, but a god can crown his words with beauty, charm, and men look on with delight when he speaks out. Never faltering, filled with winning self-control, he shines forth at assembly, grounds, and people. Gaze at him like a god when he walks through the streets. Another man may look like a deathless one on high, but there's not a bit of grace to crown his words. Just like you, my fine, handsome friend. Not even a god could improve those lovely looks of yours, but the mind inside is worthless. Your slander fans the anger in my heart. I am no stranger to sports. For all your taunts, I have held my place in the front ranks, I tell you, long as I could trust to my youth and striving hands. But now I'm wrestled down by pain and hardship. Look, I've borne my share of struggles, cleaving my way through wars of men and pounding waves at sea. Nevertheless, despite so many blows, I'll compete in your games. Just watch. Your insults cut to the quick. You rouse my fighting blood. So I really wanted to include the next few lines, but I thought as long as the quote already was, it would just be too much. But then he picks up the discus and throws it farther than any of the Phaeacians have seen anyone throw a discus before, and they're all very impressed. So this is, like I said, one of my favorite scenes in the Odyssey. But what is Odysseus trying to do here? What is the message or argument Odysseus is trying to make? Who is his audience? Obviously, his audience is still the other Phaeacians and Broadsea to a degree as well. But the argument, I think, here is more interesting to analyze than in the previous passage, because I think this one's functioning on 2 levels. One is he needs to respond to Broadsea immediately. He doesn't want to be embarrassed in front of the other Phaeacians, so he needs to respond to Broadsea, to take this challenge on and meet it. But I think at a deeper level, he's still trying to get that ride home, trying to get that ship, right? Because if he looks weak here in front of the other Phaeacians, they're probably less likely to give him the boat. So it's really operating at 2 levels. And often you'll see that where a writer will have an immediate purpose, and then there's a deeper, bigger, more large-scale concern as well, operating at a more subtle level beneath the surface. How does Odysseus use credibility, pathos, and logos, logic, as well as other means to persuade his audience to his argument? So I love this speech because he backhandedly compliments and backhandedly insults Broadsea. He says you're good looking, but you're not very smart. And he does it in this complicated way. No one would normally take this many words to say that. But he shows how gifted he is as a speaker. So he's saying, you're very good looking and strong and fit, but you're not very smart. And he says the gods don't hand out all gifts equally. Some people are gifted here, some people are gifted somewhere else. And so he basically cleverly insults the guy who just taunted him, but at the same time draws attention to how he is smart, how the gods have given him the gifts of wit and speech. And so he both points out Broadsea's deficiencies and draws attention to his own strength in those same areas at the same time. And then he takes on the challenge. So he shows his credibility in a number of ways, but he even draws attention once again, just like he did in the last passage, to his own struggles and hardships toward the end here. So pathos comes back into play. And by talking about how the gods have gifted people in different ways, he really uses some thought out logic. He uses logic to show how Broadsea is dumb and inarticulate while he is, witty and great at speeches, witty and eloquent. So it kind of braces the blow, perhaps. Broadsea's going to be, probably pretty downtrodden after hearing the speech, but other people, they're not going to really criticize Odysseus for insulting him because he's done it in this very logical way. And so it's a powerful argument, and it's a great way to answer Broadsea's challenge. But on the larger scale part of it, again, he draws attention to his suffering, and he shows them that he's very worthy of a ride home, that he's just a worthy man in general by standing up to Broadsea's challenge here. And one last thread I'll throw out there before we move on is, it's really interesting to think about, why is Odysseus' physical prowess, throwing the discus, in addition to his wit and speech, an important part of his rhetorical approach? And I would say it comes back to that understanding of the rhetorical situation or rhetorical context, because this is ancient Greece, right? They want, a strong soldier type here, not just a clever tactician and witty speech maker. And so he also is going to respond to the physical, because they've only seen the non-physical part so far. That's why Broadsea is able to taunt him in the first place. So by also showing the physical part here, he rounds out the complete picture of what is like the ideal man in ancient Greece. And so not that physical part wouldn't be necessary in every argument, but it's necessary in this argument. So it comes back to that idea of the rhetorician for Aristotle, having the complete grasp of his method, understanding the full rhetorical situation and available means of persuasion to make the fullest, most complete argument possible. So now that you've seen two examples of what we call rhetorical analysis, let's finish out the lecture by looking at the discussion questions you can choose to take on for this assignment. The first one is to do your own rhetorical analysis. Pick a passage. I would prefer for one I haven't covered in the lecture, even though I say those are the two best ones, because I've already covered them. So pick another passage and answer the same questions I just answered. Who is the speaker? Because other people, Alcinous, Nausicaa, other people do use rhetoric here. The gods. Who is the speaker? Who is the audience? What is the speaker's message or purpose, I should say there? How does the speaker use credibility, emotion, and logic, and maybe other strategies to persuade as well? And ultimately, are they successful? Why or why not? So these are the 4 or 5 basic questions you answer when you do a rhetorical analysis. And again, why ask and answer those questions? To understand how people might be trying to persuade you, 1, and 2, to become a better persuader, communicator yourself. And so this is the question. If you want to do the rhetoric track when you become an English studies major rather than the literature track, these are the kinds of things you'll be contemplating. So there's an example of the rhetoric track type of question for you. The other 3 questions are going to explore the 3 main themes or threads I introduced in part 1 that we haven't gotten on the discussion board yet. So hospitality was really important to the ancient Greeks, and you see it on display here with the Phaeacians. If you've read the Odyssey as a whole, you've also seen it with Penelope in the handling of the suitors abusing it. So there's a lot and it was incredibly important to the ancient Greeks because you never knew if a god was going to show up at your door. They'd be disguised as humans. But I ask about it because it seems like a value that's maybe somewhat lost in our culture today and could be useful if we brought it back. So I ask in part because it's an important part of the Odyssey, but also in part because I think it's a useful thing to think about. Finally, for the last two, storytelling. It's a huge part of the Odyssey. Homer is telling a story that was part of mythology for years, and now he's written it down. Odysseus is telling his story out loud to the Phaeacians. So storytelling is a huge thing here. But I come back to this, that it's very intentional. Homer could have just told us, could have started with the end of the Trojan War and gone in order and done it all from a third-person omniscient perspective. Instead, he structures the narrative in a way where the events don't happen in chronological order, and that necessitates books 9 through 12 being Odysseus speaking out loud. Now, I know we didn't read those, but we see this setup. Book 8 ends with him about to tell the story. So my question is why? Why would Homer want those events coming from an unreliable narrator, I think there's something complex and interesting going on here with the flawed nature of Odysseus' character that's well worth exploring. And I want to introduce questions I haven't talked about in the lecture so that you have a lot to think and write about on the discussion board, because as I've said before, my favorite part of the class is reading your posts. Finally, the first word of the Odyssey is andra, which is the Greek word for man. And it could mean it's a story about a man, Odysseus, but the term mankind, we've started to use humankind more frequently today, but the term mankind refers to, both men and women, all humans, if you look up the etymology of the term mankind. And the Greek word man is used in the same way here, implying males and females. So it's really all of humankind, not just Odysseus that's evoked with the evocation to the muses and the use of the word andra at the start of the Odyssey. So the Odyssey is not just about a man, but about all of humankind. And another layer here is that Odysseus encounters all different people, not just Calypso and the Phaeacians and Zeus and Poseidon and Athena, but all other people throughout the Odyssey, humans, monsters. And so we see all these different interactions. What is the Odyssey teaching us about human relationships and interactions with others who are perhaps very different from ourselves? Because the Odyssey has a diverse cast of characters. You can answer any of these questions, just pick one from each list. So one from this part of the lesson and one from the other part. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing what you have to say about them.